"There's something wrong with your bedroom wall," my neighbor Maverick said through my front door. I froze. My coffee mug stopped halfway to my lips. "I was drilling yesterday," he continued, his voice casual. "Hit something unexpected." That single sentence unraveled everything. I set the mug down slowly on the entryway table, my fingers lingering on its warm ceramic. The apartment suddenly felt smaller, the walls closer. Maverick stood on my threshold with his usual friendly smile, but those words had changed something fundamental in the space between us. He'd been drilling into walls that separated his apartment from mine. "What do you mean, something unexpected?" I asked, keeping my voice level even though my throat had tightened. "A hole," he said. "Already there, going straight through to your side. Looks old, too, like someone's been maintaining it." The hallway behind him blurred slightly. I steadied myself against the doorframe, my mind refusing to process what he was suggesting. Maintaining it, as if someone had been deliberately keeping a passage open. A window into my private space. A hole someone had drilled and then preserved, year after year, through multiple tenants, through seasons of dust and time. I thanked Maverick in a voice that didn't sound like my own. He left, probably sensing something was wrong. I stood in my doorway for a long moment, then walked to my bedroom. The wall in question was the one behind my nightstand, the one that faced his apartment. I'd lived in this unit for 4 years. 4 years of changing clothes, of showering, of sleeping in this room. 4 years of believing I had privacy. My hands wouldn't stay still. I moved the nightstand away from the wall, dust bunnies scattering across the hardwood. The wall looked normal. White paint, smooth surface. But I ran my fingers across it anyway, searching. There. A small imperfection near the baseboard. A nearly invisible seam in the paint. I pressed my fingernail against it and felt the edge of something. Not solid wall, empty space. The room tilted. I sat down on my bed, my mind spiraling through 4 years of memories. Every private moment, every vulnerable second. The time I'd cried after my divorce was finalized. The time I'd stood naked in front of my mirror, hating my body. The nights I'd lain awake, my insomnia on full display to anyone watching through that hole. I needed to see it. I needed to understand what had been watching me. Finding a flashlight in my kitchen drawer, I returned to the bedroom and aimed it at the imperfection. The beam caught something metallic inside. Metal. Someone had inserted metal through the hole. Metal that could hold a lens. Metal that could hold a camera. I called the police at 11:47 p.m. The dispatcher's voice was professionally calm as I explained what I'd found. She assured me an officer would come within the hour. I hung up and sat on my living room couch, every nerve ending alive and screaming. My apartment suddenly felt like a stage. Every room a performance space, every moment of privacy a lie. The police arrived at 12:23 a.m. Officer Patir Knight was a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a notebook. She examined the hole with a flashlight, her expression hardening as she worked. She called for a detective. While we waited, she asked me questions. How long had I lived here? Had I noticed anything unusual? Had I ever seen Maverick acting strangely? I answered mechanically, my voice hollow. 4 years. Nothing unusual. He'd always seemed normal, friendly. We'd exchanged pleasantries in the hallway. He'd helped me carry groceries once. He'd borrowed sugar for baking. Normal neighbor things, all while drilling holes through my walls, all while watching. Detective Heron Rios arrived at 1:15 a.m. She was younger, maybe 40, with dark hair pulled back severely. She brought equipment. She photographed the hole, the wall, the nearly invisible seam. She used a scope to examine what was inside. Her jaw tightened as she looked through it. "There's a lens," she said quietly. "And a recording device. This isn't amateur work. This is deliberate. This is sophisticated." The words hit me like a physical force. Not just watching, recording, documentation, preservation. Someone had been creating a permanent record of my private moments. The thought made my skin feel like it didn't belong to my body anymore. Heron looked at me with something like pity in her eyes. "We need to search his apartment. I'll need you to consent to having officers on your property. We also need to preserve this hole as evidence, which means sealing your bedroom temporarily." I nodded. I would have agreed to anything. I wanted him arrested. I wanted to understand how deep this went. I wanted to know how many times I'd been watched, recorded, violated in my own home. The search warrant was obtained by 3:00 a.m. I watched from my living room as officers entered Maverick's apartment next door. I could hear them moving through his space, could hear the sounds of drawers opening, furniture being shifted. I sat on my couch with a blanket wrapped around me, even though the apartment wasn't cold. At 4:30 a.m., Heron came back to my door. Her expression was grim. "We found 17 cameras," she said. 17! Positioned throughout his apartment, but all focused on that wall. All recording feeds going to a central server. We're retrieving the server now. We're also finding evidence he's done this in other apartments. We've identified at least 3 other units. Other apartments, other women, other people whose private moments had been stolen and preserved, and watched and studied. The hole in my wall wasn't unique. It was a pattern. It was a system. It was something he'd perfected through repetition. I learned later that Maverick had been doing this for 8 years. 8 years across 4 different apartment buildings. 16 women in total. 16 private lives turned into content. 16 women who'd believed they were safe in their own homes while he drilled holes and installed cameras and created his archive of violation. The investigation took 3 months. During that time, I couldn't sleep in my bedroom. I moved to the couch. I hired a contractor to seal the hole and check every wall in my apartment for additional breaches. He found 2 more. 2 more holes I'd never noticed. 2 more windows into my life that I didn't know existed. The trial happened in late September. I had to testify. I had to sit in a courtroom and describe what it felt like to discover that my privacy had been systematically dismantled. I had to look at Maverick across the room and see him sitting there with an expression of complete indifference. I had to watch him as if he was a stranger, even though he'd been my neighbor. Even though he'd borrowed sugar from me. Even though I'd smiled at him in the hallway while he was already watching me. Already recording me, already violating me. The prosecutor showed evidence, thousands of hours of footage, dates and times and timestamps. The server contained detailed logs of every recording session. Every moment had been cataloged. Every violation had been documented with the precision of someone who was collecting rather than just watching. This wasn't spontaneous. This was obsessive. This was methodical. Maverick was convicted on 18 counts of voyeurism and illegal surveillance. He received a sentence of 12 years in prison. 12 years. The number felt both too long and impossibly short. 12 years for 8 years of violations. 12 years for stealing the privacy of 16 women. 12 years for turning our homes into stages and our lives into content. I moved out 2 weeks after the conviction was finalized. I couldn't stay in that apartment. Every wall felt compromised. Every room felt like it had been contaminated by his presence. The thought of living in a building where he'd lived, where he'd drilled his holes and installed his cameras and created his archive, made my skin crawl. I found a new place across town, A modern building with security cameras in the hallways and management that actually cared about tenant safety. But moving didn't fix what had been broken inside me. For months after, I couldn't undress without checking the walls. I couldn't shower without scanning for holes. I couldn't sleep without wondering if there were cameras I'd missed, if there were other violations I hadn't discovered yet. The violation wasn't just about the cameras, it was about the knowledge. It was about knowing that someone had watched, someone had seen, someone had recorded. I started therapy in October. My therapist, Celia Washington, was a woman in her 60s who specialized in trauma. She helped me understand that what I was experiencing was normal. That violation of privacy created a specific kind of wound. That my hypervigilance, my fear, my inability to feel safe in my own home were all logical responses to what had happened to me. "The cameras are gone," Celia said in one session. "But the knowledge remains. You can't unknow what you know, but you can process it. You can move through it." I worked through it slowly. I joined a support group for victims of voyeurism. I discovered I wasn't alone. There were other women who'd had their privacy stolen. Other women who'd felt that same violation, that same contamination, that same inability to trust their own homes. We shared our stories. We validated each other's fear. We helped each other understand that what had happened to us wasn't our fault. One woman, Nolan Freeman, had been recorded for 3 years before discovering it. Another woman, Aileta Flores, had been in a building where the perpetrator had targeted 6 apartments. We compared notes about the investigation process, about the trial, about the aftermath. We talked about what it meant to reclaim privacy, what it meant to feel safe again. Slowly, incrementally, I started to heal. I learned to check walls without obsessing. I learned to shower without fear. I learned to sleep in my bedroom again, even though it took months. I learned that privacy could be reclaimed, even if it couldn't be returned to what it was before. I learned that violation was a wound, but wounds could scar over and become part of your story rather than the entirety of your story. By the following spring, I'd been in my new apartment for 6 months. I'd gone through my entire unit with a contractor and had it certified as secure. I'd installed additional locks on my bedroom door. I'd put up curtains that blocked any view from outside. I'd done everything I could to create a space where I felt protected. I still checked the walls sometimes. Old habits die hard. But the checking wasn't frantic anymore. It was methodical. It was about reassurance rather than panic. It was about confirming that I was safe rather than confirming that I wasn't. The other victims and I stayed in touch. We formed a kind of informal network. We checked in on each other. We celebrated milestones. When one of us reported that she'd slept through the entire night without waking in fear, we all celebrated. When another woman reported that she'd finally felt comfortable changing clothes in front of an uncovered window, we all celebrated that too. Maverick's appeal was denied in January of the following year. He would serve his full sentence, 12 years in prison for 8 years of violations. The math still didn't feel right, but at least it was final. At least there would be no second trial, no reversal, no possibility of him walking free and doing this to someone else. I received a letter from the prosecutor's office informing me that Maverick had been denied parole. He would serve his full sentence. The letter was meant to be reassuring. It was meant to tell me that justice had been done. But justice felt like a word that didn't quite fit what had happened. What had happened was violation. What had happened was theft. What had happened was the systematic dismantling of my privacy and my sense of safety. 12 years in prison didn't undo any of that. But it did mean something. It meant that what he'd done was recognized as wrong. It meant that there were consequences. It meant that I hadn't imagined the violation or overreacted to it. It meant that the system had acknowledged that what he'd done was a crime. 2 years after the conviction, I was finally able to talk about what had happened without feeling like my chest was going to collapse. I was able to tell people that my neighbor had drilled holes in the walls to watch me, and I could say it without my voice breaking. I was able to acknowledge that I'd been violated without feeling like the violation defined me. I started speaking to other people about privacy and security. I talked to tenant groups about what to look for, what to check for, how to protect themselves. I talked about the holes in my walls as a warning to others. I talked about Maverick as a cautionary tale about the dangers of assuming that your neighbors are safe, that your apartment is secure, that your privacy is protected by default. The building management where I'd lived upgraded their security systems. They installed cameras in all the hallways. They began conducting regular safety inspections. They created a protocol for tenants to report suspicious activity. They did this partly because of my case, and partly because they didn't want another lawsuit. But they did it, which meant that other tenants would be safer. Which meant that what had happened to me might prevent what happened to someone else. I met someone new. His name was Aaron Alexander, and he was a therapist who specialized in trauma recovery. We met at a conference about privacy rights and victim support. We started talking about my case, about my recovery, about the work I was doing to help other victims. We started having coffee. We started spending time together. He understood what I'd been through because he'd worked with many people who'd experienced similar violations. Aaron never pushed me to move faster than I was ready to move. He understood that intimacy after violation was complicated. He understood that trust had to be rebuilt from the ground up. He understood that my hypervigilance wasn't a flaw in my personality, but a reasonable response to what had happened to me. A year into our relationship, I let him into my bedroom without checking the walls first. It was a small thing, but it felt enormous. It meant that I was starting to believe that this space could be safe, that this person could be trusted, that my home could be mine again, fully and completely. 3 years after Maverick's conviction, I was living a life that felt almost normal. I had a partner. I had a job that I loved. I had friends who knew my story and supported me. I had therapy sessions that were becoming less about trauma processing and more about general life stuff. I had a sense of safety that I'd thought I'd lost forever. But I never forgot the holes in my walls. I never forgot what it felt like to discover that my privacy had been stolen. I never forgot the knowledge that someone had been watching, recording, documenting my most private moments. That knowledge was part of me now. It was woven into my story. It was part of how I understood the world and my place in it. I understood now that privacy wasn't something you could take for granted. I understood that safety was something you had to actively create and maintain. I understood that trust, once broken, could be rebuilt, but never quite returned to its original state. There would always be a scar. There would always be a place where the wall had been breached and then repaired. The repair was strong, but you could always see where the damage had been. The other victims and I still met regularly. We'd expanded from a support group to something more like a community. We'd started an organization dedicated to privacy rights and victim support. We gave presentations to apartment buildings and tenant groups. We advocated for better security measures. We worked with legislators to strengthen laws around voyeurism and surveillance. We did this work partly for ourselves and partly for everyone who would come after us. Everyone who might experience what we'd experienced. Everyone whose privacy might be threatened in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Maverick was still in prison. I didn't think about him very often anymore. When I did, I felt something like pity mixed with anger. Pity for whatever had happened in his life that had led him to this. Anger that he'd chosen to violate 16 women rather than seeking help for whatever was broken inside him. But mostly, I didn't think about him at all. I thought about my life. I thought about my future. I thought about the work I was doing to help other people. I thought about how violation could be transformed into purpose, how trauma could be transformed into action, how the worst things that happened to you could become the catalyst for helping others avoid experiencing the same thing. The holes in my walls had been sealed. The cameras had been removed. The recordings had been deleted. But the experience remained. The knowledge remained. The violation remained. And I'd learned to live with that. I'd learned to carry it without letting it carry me. I'd learned to use it as fuel for something meaningful, rather than letting it consume me. Today, I live in a home that feels safe. I sleep without fear. I change clothes without checking the walls. I shower without scanning for holes. I've reclaimed my privacy, not in the sense that the violation never happened, but in the sense that I've taken back control of my space and my life. I've learned that privacy is a right worth fighting for. I've learned that safety is something worth building. I've learned that violation is a wound that can heal, and that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means transforming the pain into purpose. If you've experienced voyeurism or surveillance, know that you're not alone. Know that what happened to you wasn't your fault. Know that healing is possible. Reach out to organizations that support victims of privacy violations. Connect with others who've experienced similar trauma. Take back your space. Take back your life. You deserve that.